see that we have a quorum present. So with the quorum present, calling the Actuarial Committee meeting to come to order. Like here, soft.
We're going to call him Christine.
Okay. And Ashley Rindo, Christine. Would you please develop a roll call?
Chair Robert May.
Here.
Keith Brainerd.
Here.
Josh McGee.
Here.
I give approval to we're moving to the next point, approval of the October 13, 2017 critic report. Of the committee minutes. And
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we suspend the reading of the minutes.
Second.
all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Minutes of the prior meeting are approved.
You would start
Come down here.
yes, system actuarial review and
Call
ask
them.
Kenny to present. Kenny to present litigation first.
We're going to discuss now the Greenville Firefighters Relief and Retirement Fund, and I'm going to call on Kenny Herball of the staff to give a report.
Thank you, Chairman May. Members, I have only a couple of prepared comments. My intention was to walk through the executive summary quickly and point out a few highlights and then answer any specific questions that you might have. So I don't know if you guys, I know you guys have spent some time reviewing this, so if there's anything specific, I can skip the highlights, or it's up to you all. All right, let me just walk through real quick. The general structure of the report, as well as the executive summary, is we have a few items that we noted when looking at the historical trends of the plan. We have a risk summary section, or a risk analysis section, where we walk through looking at the potential projections of what might happen in the future, and then we draw a couple of conclusions based on that. So one of the things that we noted was that the Greenville fire, based on the information we had at the time, the most recent plan valuation had an amortization period of 55 years, which is one of the highest in the state. Their funded ratio is currently below 48%. Again, one of the lowest in the state. It also indicates that their inactive liabilities are not fully funded, much less the active liabilities that they currently have. Their accrued liability did grow significantly over the past 17 years, while their assets did not. So their unfunded liability has quadrupled since 2000. And we examined the causes for the growth in the unfunded accrued liability. The overwhelming majority was due to investment returns being lower than the assumed rate of return. And the second largest cause was due to the actual contributions being less than the normal cost plus the interest on the unfunded accrued liability. We did note that while they have lowered their assumed rate of return from 8.25% to 8% in 2016, we looked at the data that we had available, which goes back to 1995, and the 13 10-year periods ending between 2004 and 2016, their compound annual return did not achieve 8% at any point during that period. And during a similar period, they have underpaid what is referred to as the actuarially determined contribution in these reports. In this particular case, it is the contribution necessary to maintain a rolling 30-year amortization period. That's what is currently required to be reported in the Texas Government Code. So moving on to some of the risks, we did note that based on looking at a number of different capital market assumptions, so we looked at Horizon Actuarial, which produces a 20-year, 10 and 20-year capital market assumptions. We also took a look at JP Morgan and Pension Consulting Alliance. They both put out 10-year projections on capital market assumptions. So we took the current asset allocation of the plan and those capital market assumptions and projected what the expected returns would be over the next 30 years. What we found was that they are more than twice as likely. If the true mean return is 8%, they are twice as likely to earn less than 7% over that period than they are to earn 9%. And the reason for that particular discussion we go into a little bit more detail, but the key point being that based on current capital market assumptions, it seems that they are likely to underperform their expected return on assets. There are, we did raise a couple of concerns regarding whether the liability, how the economic and demographic assumptions fare, and we just wanted to note that given their current funded status, they are in a difficult position to weather any adverse experience that they might have. So given that they are less than 48% funded, even if they achieve their long-term rate of return, their funded status is expected to remain fairly low, definitely below 70% in the near term. And so there was some concern raised there as well. And the primary conclusions that we drew were that one, they should continue to take advantage of the funding soundness restoration requirement and working together, so the system and the city discussing their issues and trying to work together, and as well as continuing to monitor their actuarial assumptions for appropriateness over the near term. I will note that all of our projections.
Galveston.
No, I'm talking about Greenville.
Talking about Greenville
Yes.
first.
I will note that the majority of our projections and our base assumptions are based on a 17.3% contribution rate, which they just increased in October of 2017. We were not aware that they had increased their voted to increase their contribution, the employer contribution, up to 19.3 effective October 2018. So that was not taken into consideration in any of the projections.
Maybe I just misheard you in terms of who the actuary is for Greenville.
Greenville is John Kreider. I didn't make that statement.
Okay.
So I'm happy to answer any questions about the review itself, any of our projections that we did, any other findings.
Be first to the members of the committee for questions.
If not, then we can hear from the city and the fund. So you want to
Right.
invite?
Let me see. Do you have any questions from committee members?
No, sir, thank you.
All right. We'll go now to hearing from
The mayor of the city of Greenville
the mayor of the city of Greenville
and John Kreider
and the actuary for the system.
and the board chair.
And the board chair is also here. And could all of you come to the table? Who would like to go first?
You want me to introduce?
My name's Craig Himes. Thank y'all for allowing us to be here to speak.
I'm the chairman of Greenville's pension board. This is Mayor Dreiling, City of Greenville. This is our actuary, John Kreider, and then we also have Vice Chairman Brian Osmus and Secretary Derek Sheets present. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to the mayor. He can explain what the city has come up with as far as correct the solution.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and for giving us the opportunity to tell you what we think is a solid plan that will achieve where we need to be. In your executive summary, it talks about you've looked back as far as 1995, and you've looked at the rate of returns and the contributions by the cities. And I got to tell you, any kind of a city, it's a city council that has to put money into a fund. It's not just a general thing. And within our city charter, most you can have is, for a council member or a mayor, is a 6-year term. And I've only been mayor for 3 years, so I can't really put the finger on the people that were before me that either did or didn't do what they did. And I just, we all recognize that what's happened in the past has happened in the past. We can't change that. I can't go back and change any of those numbers. The only thing we can do is to take the information that's been provided, do some analysis, and come forward with a plan. One thing that I would like to identify to you is I've lived in Greenville for 32 years, and for the last 29 to 30 years, it's been a very steady non-growth. When I moved there in 1986, the population was 22,100. On our street signs right now, it's 26,600. With the growth that we've had in the last 3 years, I think our population has jumped up to, we're sitting right around 29,000 to 30,000. So we're seeing a great increase there. The city is growing. We're seeing a lot of retail. We're seeing a lot of industry coming in. So the city is doing well. The city is growing. We're not backtracking. And as I said, all I can do is take a look at the information. My background is a business background, not as a politician. So I address things from a business side and looked at the problem. We've done some analysis, and I think the plan that I'm about to express to you, which we've sent in, I think will reach where we need to be. Back in December of 2012, the retirement fund had an infinite period of time for the actuarial to pay off the accrued liability. And it was recommended by Mr. Kreider to the people that were in charge at that time that both firemen and the city should make contributions and try and fix that problem. Try as he did, the people that were in power at that time did nothing. By December of 2014, the increase had gone up by a somewhat. The contribution rate for both the city and the firemen had increased, and our rate was recalculated down to 70.4 years. In December of 2014, the city increased their contribution to 16.8%, and the members increased their rate to 16.3%. John did reassessment, reevaluation, and it came up at 49.4 years. And as you're very, very familiar with, the plan was identify what your level was and can you get down to below 40 within 10 years. When we were at 49.4, our assessment was that we would drop by a year or by a point each year, so that within the 10-year period we would reach the required 40 years. And you obviously agreed with that, because in January of 2017 we got a letter from you saying that we were in complete compliance. So being the mayor at the time, it was nice to get that and see that we were on track. And then later in 2017 we got the notice that you had changed your plan, going from 40 years to 30 years. And the city, before we had done full analysis on that, we started working towards that. We increased our contribution by another 0.5%. And that means over the last 3 years while I was in there, we increased the contribution to the Fireman's Fund by 2%, which is, for a city, is a pretty good increase. With your latest review and with our analysis and with the help that John's given, we realize there's 2 reasons, or at least 2 reasons why we're here. The first, our amortization period exceeds the goal of 30 years. Second, as was identified, our investment, the return was at 8.25, and we dropped that back to 8%, and that put us in the same category as 24 out of the 90 people, or the 90 cities that you're evaluating. What we've done, and this has been a lot of work with John Kreider and the Greenville's finance director to help me come up with a plan, and I've already briefed the city council on this as a plan that we need to move forward to, and we won't vote on that until obviously it's budget time, which will be in September. But we've already reduced the 8.25% to 8%, and when we did that, that brought our 49.4 to 55 years, and while it gets us beyond where we wanted to be, it went in the wrong direction. I think that provides a more realistic number. And the city has, we've looked at it, we're going to increase our contribution to the fund for an amount of about $80,479, and that's a 2% increase. And when that's done, that should drop us from the 55 years down to 37.7 years. And by 2025, which was one of the goals that you had requested, we should be at the 30-year goal. Now, in the report that I supplied to you, Exhibit A shows a summary of the plan, and that shows that we're in, by 1 October, we plan to be at a 19.3% in total contribution, with 16.3 coming from the firefighters, and that puts us at a 35.6 point, and the numbers there, I'm not going to bore you with that, puts us at the 37.7 years that we figured it would do. Exhibit B shows on a year-by-year basis of exactly where we think the number will be, and that shows that by December of 2024, we will be at 29.957, so we will be under the 30-year goal. And obviously you can see from the slope of that graph, that bar chart, that it will continue to drop down, so that while we'll meet the 30%, I think in years beyond that it will continue to go down. And a good goal would be to kind of level out around 20%. That would allow us to have any care in case of fluctuations in the market. And that's about all I have on our presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
A general question, Texas A&M also in Greenville or not?
No, Texas A&M Commerce is about...
Commerce, sorry.
It's up in Commerce, and that's about a 15-minute drive.
You interact with that back and forth?
We interact a lot with them, and a lot of the students come from Greenville, and we have good relationships with them. The growth up there has just been fantastic, and as everything is happening and the growth that we're seeing, it's just, we're in the stage of where the city is booming as far as increase. Last year alone, we opened 16 new restaurants. We added a couple of major retail businesses. Housing is just going, people are selling houses faster than they can build them. I have one contractor that came in, bought enough land to put in 30 homes, went through the necessary zoning and permit process, and got ready to start work out there. Before he could break the foundation and pour the concrete, he had sold all 30 houses. And if you've got a house in Greenville and you say, well, I think I'm going to sell this, you better have where you're going to move, because it takes about 2 weeks to sell a house.
Thanks, thank you.
Mayor Dreeling. Dryling,
Just
sorry.
close enough.
Thanks for coming down, and I'm thrilled to hear that business is good in Greenville. And I appreciate the actions that you and the City Council have taken to restore the funding condition of the plan.
Thank you.
What concerns me is that even with those actions, in several important respects, the plan is still on the outer limits of actuarially of I think where you should be. Moving toward an 8% investment return assumption, working to get to 30-year amortization period, and your payroll growth assumption is, you're headed toward 4, is that correct? Moving toward 4%?
Already did.
You're at 4%. All of which I would view as sort of on the outer limit, leaving, in my view, very little margin for getting to where we need to be. And, if the markets don't perform as anticipated, if payroll growth doesn't produce as anticipated, other actuarial methods and assumptions don't pan out as we hope, then we don't have any room for margin. And I would strongly encourage the city to review these actuarial methods and assumptions further, and try to arrive at a very sober and realistic assessment and cost of what it's going to take to get the city in a sound actuarial condition, because obviously you're not there now, and you're really envisioning only a best case scenario on every front in order to get where really you want to be. Glad to see you reducing the return assumption to 8%. What is the basis of the 8% return assumption?
May I answer that question?
Please.
The actuarial standards call for developing the rate of return using what's called a building block rate of return method. And the development of the expected rate of return on the existing portfolio appears on Exhibit 2 of the fund's GASB 68 disclosures. Those were forwarded to the PRB in December. If you just take a straight the result that comes out of the building block rate of return method, you come up with an expected rate of return of 8.49%. So that is the document we've furnished documentation of what was done in that regard.
Thank you. Is that a 30-year projection, sir?
Well, the building block rate of return looks at the assumed rate of return, or the rate of return history of each asset class. For example, S&P 500 bond stocks, and then that expected rate of return is weighted by how much the fund has invested in each of those asset classes. In this particular case, the rates of return used for each asset class are based on the rates of return reported by organizations like Vanguard and Russell from 1995 forward.
Okay. What is the inflation assumption?
3%.
So you're using a real rate of return of 5%?
Yes, sir.
And do any of those models that you're using project a real rate of return of 5%?
Under the model, which models?
Well, you referred to Vanguard and Russell and so on.
They are reporting the nominal rates of return on their so-called quilt pages or periodic table reports. Are you familiar with what I'm referring to?
Yes, sir.
And those are on a year-by-year basis, the inflation for that then the geometric rate of return since 95 is calculated, and that's used. And when that's done with the Greenville Fund, the number that comes out is 8.49%.
So is the 8.49% based on solely a retrospective look at the
Yes, sir.
performance of the markets?
Yes, sir.
So it's not prospective?
That is correct. We don't know what is going to happen in the future. If you look at the period from 95 through 2000, in this case 2016, you have some very, very bad years as well as some good years. And so there are people that claim that they can do a prospective projection of rate of return. I doubt if any one of them predicted a 20% rate of return for 2017, but it is a retrospective to answer. Yes, it is retrospective.
Every capital market assumption projection that I've seen in the last 12 to 18 months has projected for a typical portfolio such as that of your fund, a projected return in the ballpark of 7, maybe 7.5%. Inflation, the Fed is struggling to get inflation to 2%. My concern is that y'all are being very optimistic both on both components of the building block, the inflation side and on the real rate of return. Many public pension funds use capital market projections to set their investment return assumption. I've never seen a public pension fund use retroactive returns solely to justify what might happen in the future.
Okay.
I would strongly encourage you to reconsider the methodology that you use to arrive at the 8%.
Very well.
Thank you.
To continue on this, I mean, the saying that what plops out of this formula is an 8.49% return, and that's the expectation going forward, stretches credulity. I mean, it's amazing to me. Your peers, your largest peers in the nation, are quickly trying to lower their assumed return because they're looking at capital market assumptions and going through the same procedure and arriving at a go-forward rate of return that is 6.5 to 7, stretching to 7.5. And it's incredibly problematic that you are only at 8. Incredibly problematic.
Very good.
Now, it would be very interesting. You, as the actuary, are you the person in charge of doing the building block approach?
Yes, sir.
What inputs came to you? Did you determine the method for looking retroactively, choosing the period and everything?
Well, I went back about as far as I could get data. 95 is a fairly long way, and it's also the start of pretty close to the start of a market cycle.
So the answer is yes, that you are the one who developed the capital market assumptions
Yes, I am.
that went into the building blocks.
That's correct.
Did you consult with any capital market experts?
No, I talk with in the course of business, I speak with individuals, for example, asset managers, and their consensus is that for the short term, that is a high assumption. For the long term, many of them feel that can be made. I will tell you, this is the second time I've had to come in and justify the assumption. The other was in around 1990, and I got a summons from the Internal Revenue Service. I was working on a retirement plan, for a small retirement plan, and the rate of return used was between 6 and 7%. And the IRS was going to disallow the deduction and demand that it be valued at 8%. So 8% seems to be an unlucky number to choose. Nobody seems to like it. But
so for me, that story is neither here nor there. We've got a plan that has less than 50% of the money needed to pay benefits, and that is estimated using an incredibly high assumption. So if we used 7%, I would guess that percentage would drop to around 30%. That's very problematic. As the PRB actuary stated, there is not enough money in the plan to even cover the inactives. I can't stress how strained a situation that is and how much that worries me. Mr. Mayor, I appreciate you coming here. I appreciate all of this. I would encourage you to seek outside guidance and chair of the board, outside guidance on capital market assumptions that goes beyond a single person who is your actuary, who does not necessarily travel in those circles. And given the sensitive nature of that key assumption, I think you should seek multiple opinions on that.
If I may, what I'd like you to recognize is we've made major assumptions, major changes based upon what's been going on, and your capital assumptions is based upon what the market's done in the last 5 years. As we've all seen, the market last year has gone up extremely well. The economy in the nation is going up extremely well. So I think in 2 years you're going to see a vastly different number as far as what a overall rate of return is. But I think the thing that's more important is we do this deep analysis every 2 years, and it's reported on. Now, this plan to get to 2025 and drop down to be at 30% covers an 8-year period. The City Council and the board is going to look at that every time, and if we have to make future adjustments, then that's the opportunity for the City Council to do. But I'm not sure that I don't want to approach and say, well, I'm going to put in an excessive amount of money just because of assumptions on what the market may or may not do. So I think the fact that our City Council is trying to meet the goals, is working on the best information we have, and it will be looked at every 2 years when we get the report together, then that allows us to make adjustments as needed to get the numbers that we need to. So it's not just we sit back in a closet and do nothing.
And I appreciate that
also
very much.
Point out,
Just
I'm sorry.
one second. So you deserve credit for taking steps to address this significant challenge. Coming up with additional dollars to go into this plan, I understand, is not easy. It's relatively easy, as is demonstrated by some of your predecessors, to ignore this problem. So I don't mean to imply that there is not credit here. The spirit of my comments is that I would seek on this particular piece to get multiple opinions on what is reasonable and take proactive steps to address that. So I would just encourage you, your presentation presented the plan as something that we've got a plan and it's going to work. I think part of that plan, which you just alluded to, is a constant reevaluation and consultation with experts to make sure that you can pay the benefits that have been earned and promised to public employees. Right now, you don't have enough money.
No.
And it's increasingly looking like going forward you're not going to have enough money. Looking at projections, you're not making headway against the unfunded liability for a very long time. You're essentially maintaining your current funded status. You may creep up a little bit on the amortization period and funded ratio, but you're essentially maintaining your funded status less than 50% into perpetuity, given current funding. So let's be honest about where we are. We've stabilized, but you're projecting. I'm looking at reports here based on funded ratios that show that you're going to be around the 50% funded ratio for the next 30 years. We're going to hit a recession at some point. I agree that the market has been good over the last little bit. The labor market is tight. The U.S. economy, I wouldn't say it's great. It's certainly not 90s great. It's pretty good. But also the stocks are at their high in terms of price to earnings. They're priced very high. Bond yields are incredibly low. You have to actually dig underneath and see where we are. And I'm afraid that we look at this as kind of a static thing. So I'm encouraged to hear you say, look, we're going to continue to evaluate this and figure out how to take the next step, because I think this is a good, positive step in the right direction, but it's only a step and many more steps are needed.
As the actuary, John Kreider, as we move, assuming we have a noticeable, over several years, or at least for 1 year, we have some real profits as we're seeing now in the market. are you using a 5-year smoothing
Yes, I
method
am.
so that I think that's real important to spread that out and not to be on market value, and it goes real high and you say we've really solved things, and then you go and it goes real low. So that's widely used in the actuarial circle, is using a 5-year averaging of rates of return. And that way you partially begin to recognize those gains to offset past losses, but you don't do it in one.
That's correct. I'm suspicious that basically for the 12/31/2018 valuation, only 40% of the large gains in 2017 will be taken into account. The rest will be ignored. And so I expect that the rate of return on the actuarial value of assets will not rise to a full 8% immediately, because we have the 3 down years of 14, 15, and 16. The up years, one of them has already been fully recognized. The other will be recognized 20%, and then the 2018 will only be recognized 20%. So there's no danger of over recognizing the 2017 gains, regardless of how large they are. Plus, there's also, we're not going to hit that, but there's also a 20% corridor. We would never use more than 120% of market value to begin with.
And I apologize if I gave you the impression we were going to look at a 1-year growth.
No,
because
you didn't. I just wanted to.
with a 5-year, you have slack years, you have growth years, and that 5-year period moves along. So John is working and tracks that. But we've seen that, since the Depression in 2008, market went way down and it's gradually coming back up. But like you said, in 2017, it's grown a lot. None of us believe that it's going to continue at that same rate forever. It's going to reach a plateau. There's going to be some depression. But I think that the overall 5 years is going to change as time goes along. And as I identified, as part of the council, we've got to look at that because it affects our city as a whole on everything that's going on as far as people coming in, shopping, how much money they've got, and what money the council has available to be able to make contributions. And so I didn't want to give the impression that we were only looking at 1 year, and if so, I apologize.
One quick point on history here. So 2008 was about 10 years ago. Since then, we've been in a bull market.
But it hit bottom real quick and went way down.
If you were all in stocks, you lost 30 to 40%. You recovered in a couple of years. The market bounced back much faster than the U.S. economy did in terms of growth. We've been in a pretty significant bull market. The reason for your 50% funded ratio is not market itself. In fact, this 10-year period was the time to recover. And we're still looking at funded ratios that are less than 50%. So I just want to the doom and gloom. I get that 2008 was a significant event, but it's 10 years in the rearview mirror and the subsequent 10 years have been bull market. If you look at periods from recession to recession, 10 years is getting pretty long. I think that in our heads we have to level set here a little bit and be honest about what's happened over the last 10 years in the market and in your fund, and realize that the recovery has not hit your fund the way we hope it would, and that it's time to start taking real steps to address that.
May I ask you to look at page 8 of my presentation, please? It's the last page, and it's the color graph. While your statement is true, I think it also needs to be recognized, and I don't understand why this is not brought up more often. This is not of the Greenville Fund. This is of 34 plans in the Texas Local Firefighter Retirement Act system. And you can see that all of those have very low returns for 14, 15, and 16. To say that there's been a constant bull market over the last 10 years is not exactly the case. Now, some of this, I think, has to do with when the downward blips occurred, because I think they occurred in the way to do the most possible damage to calendar year plans. But to say that there's been an unremitted bull market is probably not the full story.
I'm sorry, do you see many negative returns on here? Was 14, 15, 16, do we see negative, or are we just saying we didn't hit our 8?
Well, we didn't hit our 8.
Okay, so maybe it's that your assumption is a little too high and not the fact that the market hasn't been growing.
Okay.
The market has been growing over time, has been growing continuously. We haven't seen, generally we say that a correction is a 10% drop in the market. We haven't seen that in a very long time. We've seen annualized returns that are positive. And usually pretty healthy, although not consistently at your rate of return. That, for me, would lead every one of you at the table to really question, do we have the right rate of return? Instead of looking at the 90s, which by all accounts, we could go back in time for stock market returns. The 90s were historic. They, in all of measured economic history, the 90s were historic. And so basing your go-forward return assumption on a historic upswing in the economy, a time when the internet was invented and there were lots of forces pushing those market return higher, I would just really question that, and I think that you should question that and seek outside support to make sure that that's a reasonable assumption.
Okay. Would you like, this is more of a rhetorical question. I don't want to appear rude. What do we think that the 10-year average rate of return will be this time next year?
Mr. Kreider, you're an enrolled actuary.
Okay.
Are you familiar with ASOP 27?
Yes, sir.
Then you're familiar with the feature of ASOP 27 that requires you to consider future expectations.
Yes, sir.
Yet you've told us here that you looked only retrospectively at retrospective returns with regard to setting the return assumption.
Where else can you go except to look at the past and extrapolate it to the future? I mean, you'll see a lot of projections forward, and in fact, Kenny quoted 3 of them, I believe. But I just feel like that's really a way that we're going to have to do it now. You've recommended that the fund get some additional capital market assumptions, and I'll encourage them to do that, and we will include that in the material that we evaluate.
Thank you.
And just to close the loop on this, I'm not going to sit here and say, coming down on the investment rate of return is easy. It requires tough decisions in terms of how much money goes into the fund. It requires strength to understand that you're not in the financial position that you wanted, and that's hard. So I'm not trying to say, to overnight you lower this thing to 7 or 6.5 or anything like that. However, it is a little disconcerting to have somebody say, look, the return assumption is justified because we can get 8.5. I think that you guys need to have the mindset that we are probably too high and we need to come lower to make sure that we secure the benefits that we promise to workers. And we're going to take action to make sure that we monitor this, and probably will have to come down in the future, and that's going to require more money. Instead of the optimistic, well, we might get 9. Or 8.5 or whatever it is. So that's all I'm saying is that put pressure on that because this is a big deal for the retirement security of your workers.
I appreciate that, and we will look at it and we will watch it. As I identified, there's a set amount of money that's available in the city because we're trying to handle everything in the city. That's what the council's job is. And I think that in the last 3 years, by adding another 2%, that's going to be a large increase in the last 3 years, much more than what my predecessors had done clear back to 2012. So yes, we're going to look at it. We're going to monitor it. But the numbers next year, we may have to increase the amount we're putting in there. But right now, our target, given everything that we know right now, We can all make projections, but our best projection, given the data that we have right now, gets us to that number and looks like we'll continue down. If when we look at this again in 2 years and say, we're not at that level, we're going to have to make adjustments, and that's things that are going to have to be done. But I appreciate your observations and recommendations.
Just continuing on Keith's point, so we've talked about the rate of return. A lot of the assumptions here are pushing cost out into the future. Your 4% payroll growth assumption, that's important because it sets your amortization schedule, your debt service schedule on the unfunded liability. And that just means you have a 4% grade on that. Your contribution is expected to increase 4% a year regardless of what payroll does. And I understand that payroll has been growing pretty precipitously, and that's a recent phenomenon given the growth of the city. But there are a number of those assumptions that you need to keep an eye on too. The entirety of the funding plan is important. Your 30-year rolling is another element of this. So while you're kind of ticking down a little bit, your current funding policy will not result in fully paying off the unfunded liability in 30 years. It's going to take much longer. And so just keep an eye on the entire funding plan.
We will.
I would just note that this issue of the amortization, the interest rate and the 8%, excuse me, it's not just you. It's spread out all over Texas and around the United States that we could be making these same types of issues with any large number of others. We've seen the Texas state employee plan drop its assumption from 8 to 7.5, and their actuary had encouraged them to look at 7, but they also had 30 or 40 people in the audience who were state employees that felt like that was too strong. So there were some difficult issues, and the issues are difficult all over the state.
Thank you.
In the report that I saw, and I believe it came from your executive director, it indicated, I think it was in this report, and please correct me if I was wrong, that you listed about 90 funds that you're looking at and monitoring. And as I looked at it, yes, we were one of the few that were well over 8%, but at the time there was 24 out of 90 that were in the 8%. So I felt less concerned when we dropped from 8.25 to 8, because I thought we were in a very large group that was there. And but it's something that's got to be monitored, something that's got to be looked at. So I do appreciate your inputs on there and your recommendations.
I think you're in a very large group. It feels like you've got some company there. In terms of nationally, you're way above the median, the kind of average plan for the country. The average plan for the country is at 7.5. The cohort that is 8 is a smaller percentage. And usually if you look at the performance of those plans over time, that's not the company you want to keep.
Well, it might have been an easier time if my predecessors had paid attention at all.
I agree with that. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the steps you're taking.
It's my pleasure. Is there anything else we can do for you?
Well, you have a couple of other people here, I believe. Would one or both of you like to give us comments?
Do you have anything?
No.
Do either of you? And I would like to identify that the 3 firemen we have here are all captains, and they're very diligent. They work very, very hard, and we're proud to have them as part of our team. Our pension review board within Greenville meets on a monthly basis. They're there. They're working hard on it. We've got I attend virtually all the meetings. Sometimes I get called away to something else, but I attend most of those. Our finance director for the city attends those, and we have a ex-banker that is another member in there. So we're watching this, we're looking at it, we're trying to ensure that everything is done the best we can. And well, I'll tell you, if I could predict what's going to happen in the market in 6 months, I wouldn't be here. I'd be living in Bermuda. But we're doing the best we can, we're working on it, and we get a lot of input.
We appreciate y'all coming out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Members, just a quick note from the staff's perspective. I would like to add that given the fund and the city have a very good working relationship, we are encouraged to see that moving forward as we provide any assistance on your plan. I think that's definitely a positive for the fund.
Point of clarification with staff, you said that the increase in the city's contribution rate was not included in the projections in this report. We're updating that for the full board when we send it to the full board for approval and release.
That wasn't something that is discussed, but if that's what you'd like to occur, then certainly we will include that.
Yep, we can certainly do that, members, and given we would be reporting this information to the legislature as the final step in the process in November, I think it's only fair, given the city and the members have raised their contribution, to include that information in our updated report.
Absolutely. I would prefer that this be as up to date as possible.
Thank you.
Just as you said, you're working hard on this, and we appreciate that at your local level, and you're paying more attention to it than in the past. In my view, that's true at the state level too. I think the state legislature is much more concerned about pension plans than it used to be, and so we're in a different environment now.
Understand. Is there anything else?
No.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and to answer any questions, and I hope we can continue, and really I hope our numbers are good. Thank you very much.
I do too.
Thank you.
Next plan on our, we can go ahead and adopt a motion for renewal filer. So since the board did, the committee did recommend changes, you want to go ahead and make this motion. Make this motion.
Right here.
Members, we do have a motion for you.
The motion is to direct the staff to finalize the draft in version for the Greenville Firefighters Relief and Retirement Fund, incorporating changes agreed on by the committee, and any technical changes to present to the full board for final review at the March 1 meeting.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And we're ready to go to
Do you want to say motion passed?
yes, the motion passed.
Yeah, let's do that.
We're going to now move to a discussion of the Galveston employees' retirement system for our police. And I'm going to call on staff member Kenny Herbaugh to deliver the report.
Members, I would say that generally speaking, we have some very similar results for Galveston as we do for Greenville. One thing I will point out that was not taken into consideration in this particular review was Galveston has voted to decrease their assumed rate of return from 8% to 7.5%. I believe it's effective 1/1/2018, so we don't have data to incorporate that. So that isn't included in all of these projections. So again, we have very similar results. Galveston has a funded ratio that is less than 42%, and again, it does not fully cover their inactive liability. The funded ratio and the unfunded accrued liability has grown drastically over the past 17 years. We had data back 10 years, and we found very similar results that the primary reason was due to investment returns being lower than the assumed rate of return, and actual contributions being less than the normal cost plus the interest on the unfunded accrued liability. Again, their discount rate was 7.5% net of all expenses at one point in time. When that changed to 8%, it was to account for a change in how expenses were being dealt with. And again, they've now dropped it back down to 7.5%, but I believe if you look at their 10-year compound returns for the 10 periods ending 2007 through 2016, I don't believe they've hit 7.5% through that period either. Another concerning item was their non-investment cash flow dropped to a negative 9.79%. While a negative investment cash flow is certainly expected in a mature plan, with a funded ratio of this level, it can cause some significant concerns if assets have to be sold off in order to meet your current expenses and benefits. The amortization period in the most recent evaluation was 48.7 years. Again, one of the highest in the state. Taken into consideration in some of the projections, but not in the historical information, was also a change in a special valuation that was completed for the plan. The system has reinterpreted the state statute, which says that the employer is required to pay the employer normal cost plus admin expenses and interest on the unfunded accrued liability. Historically, the contribution has been fixed at 12%, was recently raised to 12.83% for the employer contribution. So the majority of the information is based on that type of contribution. The city has not agreed to the changes in the contribution in the new valuation, and I know that the plan's actuary is here. He could probably elaborate a bit more on that. We did find we came to similar conclusions, similar risk issues. They have a very similar asset allocation to a lot of other public pension plans, which, looking at capital market assumptions and where they are expected to be, again, they are significantly more likely to underperform their assumed rate of return than they are to outperform it, especially in the near term. Similar conclusions as well, that the city and the system should consider utilizing the FSRP requirement to work together to develop a plan to move forward. And I don't think that continually monitoring their assumptions and keeping an eye on things moving forward are the general conclusions.
Committee members, do you have any comments or questions for Kenny at this point?
Only question I have, Kenny, just to make sure I heard you right, that what is it that is not captured in our report that has happened recently?
The assumed rate of return was decreased from 8% to 7.5%. So,
but that is happening in this calendar year or this fiscal year, I mean?
I believe it's happening in their next valuation when it's supposed to occur.
Got it. Thank you.
Representatives of the city and the fund.
Representatives of the city and the fund, would like to hear.
From the city, Assistant City Manager David Buckley.
David Buckley.
And from the fund, the actuary David Sawyer and the legal counsel Stefan Smith.
I think we have the lawyer and the actuary here also.
It's always a good combination.
Good morning.
Good morning. Glad to have you here.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Dan Buckley. I'm the Deputy City Manager for the City of Galveston. The mayor and the city manager, I want to express their apologies for not being here, but council is ongoing right now, so they could not attend today. So I got the short straw. I'm here. I will tell you that I'm hopeful that I can answer all your questions and deal with these issues as we go through your report and our response. I came to the city, just brief history, about 3.5 years ago. One of the things that was asked of me when I got here was to deal with the pensions. I have an extensive capital markets background. We hired one of the premier finance people in the state to come to the city, and of our 3 pension plans, one is very sound now. It wasn't then.
Which one is that?
The employee plan. The fire plan, we've reached agreements with the fire department, the union, and it's out for a vote now, and they'll be going to council next month, and it will resolve the plan issues on the fire plan. The only plan remaining is this plan, the police plan. We haven't made a lot of progress on it. Council last year approved in the budget up to a 2% increase in the city's contributions, and they instructed staff to work with the pension board to try to reach compromise and look at the plan benefits, the overall plan structure, and see if we could make a concerted effort to make modified changes to the plan to bring it within reasonable actuarial basis for it to be a sound plan. We haven't had any success to this point to do that. We are hopeful. There's been some changes in the leadership of that plan. The new chairman has expressed a desire to work with the city to bring the plan into compliance. The issue at this point is that he says the police union has given all they're going to give, so they're not going to be willing to make any changes. So they're looking to the city to fund all the issues, or to fund the entire balance of the unfunded liability. As you can understand and appreciate, that's a large pill for a city to swallow. We don't believe the city's obligation is to work independent of the trustees. It is an independent plan. It's controlled by the Board of Trustees. The city has one appointment directly by the manager, and that's Mr. Lofton as the finance director of the city. The council then appoints one other representative, or two other, representatives, and then the union has 4 seats on the board, so they control the board with a majority. So we haven't had a lot of success in dealing with that, but I'm very hopeful that we will going forward, because our primary focus is going to be solely on police now. In the 3.5 years I've been here, it has probably been, with the exception of a hurricane here and there, weekly we meet and talk about pensions, and the progress that we've made with the civilian plan and the fire plan is evidence of that. We understand it's one of the big issues. It's something we have to address, and council recognizes they gave us the resources we need to address it. We've hired an independent actuary to work with the city to look at the actuarial evaluations done by the various plans, and we use those tools. We've hired counsel to assist us. We're working towards it, and we haven't achieved our objective yet. We're going to keep working until we do. We understand there's an obligation to every one of those employees and the retirees to receive those benefits, and I am here to tell you that the city will do everything within its power to get there. But we are looking for, I guess, an effort on our counterparts of the trustees on the pension plan to work with us to try to resolve the issues. They didn't happen overnight, and they're certainly not going to be resolved overnight, but with a collective effort we can certainly get there. Mike has got a lot of information actuarially and financially about the report. We reviewed your report extensively, provided a multiple-page letter with our comments. This is a good process, and it's a great exercise, and I'm thankful that it's undergoing. I spent 25 years as a financial institution examiner. This is what we did. You look and you try to figure out how to fix problems, and the easiest way to fix them is work collectively, and we recognize that. So that is just my basic introduction. We'd be glad to field any questions you have. So I'll turn it back to you, and thank you again.
I don't know whether you'd want to say anything more, because you've already talked about this, but I noticed in the material that one of you sent to us discussion with the police plan board has been challenging at best.
Yes, sir.
Was the statement. You've already talked about that some, but do you have any other thoughts?
Well, I'm very hopeful with the change in leadership there that they've expressed an interest in working with us. So I'm exceedingly hopeful that moving forward we're going to have a better, a better opportunity to address the problems with the current leadership than we had in the past.
Mr. Buckley,
Yes, sir.
to that point, does the police board have the authority to set benefit levels?
They do. The trustees do, not the union board.
And have they adjusted benefit levels in recent years?
Not in my tenure. No, sir. They changed the vesting period. We negotiated that when we increased to the actuarial request last year, 0.83. And one of the conditions that we wanted and we agreed on was to bring them more in line with that of our civilian plan, which is vesting at 5 years at 50% and then 10% a year up to 100% at 10 years. So that's it's a vesting period change, not necessarily an increase or decrease in benefits.
So what is the disagreement that y'all have with the board? What decisions have they made or not made that trouble you?
It's the inability to work through and make benefit changes, discuss other options, whether they be a change of plans to a defined contribution versus a defined benefit, whether it is a modifier on the benefits for employees coming next year that aren't current employees. We just haven't had a lot of success in getting any movement from that side.
Thank you. With regard to the other plans that the city sponsors, same governance structure where the board is independent?
Yes, sir.
You're implying that you have found those other boards to be more flexible and collaborative?
We have had success from working with the other boards.
Okay.
And as I said, I'm hopeful that we will with the police board going forward.
Thank you. Is it correct that city ordinance requires the city contribute the actuarially determined contribution to the pension plan?
It is. And the actuary record at the last actuary review said 12.83%, and that's what the city increased it to.
So has the city consistently been contributing the actuarially determined contribution?
Sir, I wish I could answer that for you. I don't know what happened before I got here. I believe it's been a negotiated contribution rate.
Just point of clarification, if you look on page 11 of our report, it runs out the ADC and percent of ADC paid. I'll just point out that my understanding is the 12.83% is not the ADC. It's the actuary's recommendation based on their interpretation of state law, which is not ADC. So there's a difference here. If there's an ordinance provision, it's more stringent, more strict than state law. And I believe the actuary's recommendation is still below ADC and still below ordinance if that's an ordinance.
That's probably an accurate statement.
And I did look some at the statement that the city has not contributed the actuarially required contribution for the last 17 years. I wasn't able to get a hold of every actuarial report for that period of time, but I do believe that's substantially correct, as a matter of fact.
Is the council aware that it has failed to live up to the word of its ordinance for 17 years?
What council is aware of, sir, is that they've negotiated a contribution rate. They've been, I guess, educated to this point that the actuary presents a report. They show what the contribution rate needs to be, and council is made determinations through their budgeting process on what they're going to contribute. I can't speak directly for what prior councils may or may not have been told or what their thoughts were.
Does the city ordinance address a negotiated rate, or is the city ordinance pretty straightforward about
It's a bargaining agreement, a collective bargaining agreement with the union.
I'm sorry, but does the ordinance specify that the rate would be bargained, or does it specify that the city will pay the ADC, the actuarially determined contribution?
I don't believe the city ordinance directly discusses it.
Can I jump in as counsel?
I actually think the plan document, which is adopted by council, actually tends to follow the language in the CBA more than it does the state law. And that's just my recollection of what I've seen.
But that's not the question. We'd love to hear from council as to what the ordinance actually says.
The ordinance, so the plan existed by city ordinance prior to 1997, and it was solely governed by city ordinance and plan document provisions prior to 1997 when the state legislature passed Section 6243P of the revised statutes in 97, effective for 1998. The city ordinances reflected the city's adoption of the new state statute and a complete superseding of the pre-existing city ordinances. My historical research into the matter, however, shows that the plan document provisions that predated 1997 remained consistent after 1997, but for the insertion of introductory language into the preamble that reflected the change from it being a city ordinance created plan to a state statute governed plan. But the contribution language remained consistent regarding the sort of the negotiated rate language, verbiage that predated the passage of 6243P, which instituted the more substantive sort of formulaic language around normal cost, payment of administrative expenses, and interest on the unfunded accrued liability language that you see currently in the state law. That language didn't get reflected when the plan was amended and the city ordinances were amended back in 97, effective January 1st, 1998. And because during those years, intervening years until the economic downturn in 2008, Hurricane Ike, a reduction in force in the police department, some other several circumstances that all snowballed at the same exact time. Prior to that, there wasn't as much of a funding issue with the plan, so it was never again, I'm speculating what happened before without a whole lot of records of minutes and things like that to reflect on, but that it just was never really an issue. This, the change from the city ordinance prior to 1997 to the change of the state statute just never became a pressing issue because the economics didn't require it. And then once the snowballing of issues came with the economic downturn, the hurricanes, reduction in force, reduction in tax base, etc., expenditures needed for infrastructure, repair, etc. And then at that point, enough boards, enough time had passed that people didn't realize what had happened in 1997. And then I was asked this summer to provide research and sort of look into this issue of what was the legislative history of what occurred through this plan, pre-existing the state statute, now subsequent to the passage of the state statute in 97, and then where the plan needs to go from here from a compliance standpoint.
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, may I interrupt? I'm sorry. Would y'all mind introducing yourselves?
Sure. I'm sorry. I'm Stefan Smith. I'm a partner with the law firm of Locke Lord, and I'm outside counsel to the Board of Trustees to the plan.
Thank you.
And I'm David Sawyer. I'm the board's actuary.
Thank you. And you're Dan Buckley?
I am.
And sir, please.
Mike Lofton, Assistant City Manager for Finance for the City of Galveston.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So that was quite a mouthful that you just gave us.
You had to ask.
And I guess I just want to know whether or not the city is paying its required contribution on an actuarial basis.
Let me clarify real quickly that in the review, the actual determined contribution is being calculated on a rolling 30, not specifically in accordance with Vernon's statute and their definition. The plan historically has been contributing on a fixed rate basis. The actuary has not necessarily been calculating an actuarially determined contribution. They have been completing the evaluation in accordance with, I believe, the collective bargaining agreement and the contribution that the city was actually making.
Kenny, a point of clarification here. So, this is an interesting situation because it's incredibly messy. There was state law that superseded city ordinance that specifies essentially normal cost, admin expenses, interest on unfunded liability, but no principal payment on the unfunded liability. Then the city passed ordinance after that had language in there that said something about ADC. In the meantime, actual practice on the ground is to pay fixed negotiated rate. So to neither follow ordinance nor the state law.
No, we followed the ordinance. And the ordinance was a negotiated rate. The city paid everything that it agreed to pay through the negotiations up until this point. I mean, we still are. We still are under the contract. We're asked to pay 12.83%, which we are contributing.
And they agreed to pay, the agreement was with the board.
It's with the board.
And the board are fiduciaries.
They are, sir.
Who are responsible for operating solely in the interest of plan participants.
That's correct.
And those fiduciaries, you're saying, are agreeing to a contribution rate that is less than the actuarially required amount.
Yes, sir. Well,
and less than the state required amount.
yes.
And members, to clarify, back in the early 2000s, the plan was close to 100% funded. So it's my understanding the statutory provision wasn't probably
that's true.
invoked at the time.
The 3 years between 2000 and 2002, the unfunded liability jumped to about $10 million because of that economic downturn. Then the plan held its own, didn't do much better during the 2000s than that. Then when the downturn happened in 2008 and Ike happened at the same time, I've just since discovered, as I'm enriching my own historical knowledge of what's happened, is there were some some benefit increases just prior to Ike. So there was actually three things that happened in the plan at that point that led to a $10 million increase in the unfunded liability. And we've had this negotiated contribution situation since then that really hasn't improved it very much.
So from my perspective, I don't mean our line of questioning to be an indictment of where you guys are right now. It sounds like there's plenty of blame to go around, including with the drafting of the state law requirement that the payment only be enough to cover normal cost, admin expenses, and interest on the unfunded liability, and never actually make headway on the unfunded liability itself. But it's kind of baffling that all the actors here, this is the first time that we're really kind of piecing this together and really trying to meet this challenge head on, and all the actors here seem to have, in the past, made decisions, maybe in good faith, that have consistently underfunded this plan and resulted in a very significant underfunding situation that could roll into a crisis pretty quickly, and that's our concern here. So you guys are to be commended for digging into this and trying to figure this out. We're just trying to get it straight in our head. What in the world's going on here, and then what's the path forward? One
of the questions, if I may, that we're raising in our response to the committee and to the Pension Review Board is the language of the statute talks about the contributions, and it raises the term that the members' contributions are going to be considered the city's contributions, to just make a short, and everything is considered the city's contribution. I mean, there's no way for the city, an independent entity, to budget or control anything if they have no say-so in what's happening on the liability. The way we've interpreted the rule, and again, this is our interpretation, it may very well be wrong, is that we have to have a joint responsibility with the trustees to try to make the contributions at a level that's going to pay out the benefit. If the trustees can increase the benefit, they can't increase the benefit and place the burden on the city. There has to be some collective effort to say, yeah, here's the benefit, it's reasonable, it's appropriate, it's what everybody can agree to, and it's everybody's going to pay for. But the fact that the law allows a bargaining unit, so to speak, to unilaterally and independently increase benefits, change the plan, places an onerous burden on the municipality. But that being said, the city is steadfastly and has worked since Mike and I both got here, which was shortly together, to fix our pension plans. We've been successful on two. We're going to keep working on the police pension plan until we get it there. And as I've said numerous times, I'm hopeful we can do that.
Can I jump in and make a comment about the pickup provision that was being alluded to? Section 6.02 of 6243P references the Federal Internal Revenue Code's language regarding pickup contributions, and it does contain language that says that for these purposes, the member contributions are treated as municipal contributions, but that's a federal income tax issue. And you all may be aware, under the Internal Revenue Code, outside of Code Section 401K, which is inapplicable to a plan like this, there's no mechanism under federal tax law for an individual to make a pre-tax contribution to a contributory plan that's not a 401K plan. So 414 of the code has implemented into it a governmental plan specific provision that says, for all intents and purposes, for tax reasons, a city or a governmental entity can treat a member contribution as being made or deemed to have been made by the governmental entity, by the employer, so that you don't run into a traditional federal income tax issue of having that be a post-tax contribution to a plan. So 602 of the state statute just codifies and incorporates by reference the pickup language from Section 414 of the Federal Internal Revenue Code.
Man, things get really exciting whenever we get the lawyers involved.
And what would be interesting is that using that logic that every contribution they've made that exceeds their normal funding cost shouldn't have been tax deferred.
So I think they're, given the history on this issue, from my perspective at least, and I'm guessing that the committee may share my sentiment, that there's stuff that you guys are using for negotiation purposes, trying to get people to the table, and then there are the facts of the matter. I think that at the end of the day, we care that you guys get together and actually negotiate a fix to this thing, and it's going to take more money. There's just there's no way around it, and we could argue about section of city ordinance or state law, or I'll tell you, state law provision is not sufficient to make this thing right, and so city ordinance is not going to be enough to make this right. The past decisions of the trustees of the plan, which should have been protecting benefits, weren't enough to make this thing right, and so there's just got to be a difference in the actual solution from what was in the past, and the minutia is interesting, but it's not going to fix this, and it's going to require shared sacrifice. So I appreciate that you guys think you're going to be able to negotiate with the plan. I encourage both you and the plan to come with open minds, ready to actually fix this, and not get hung up on the details of state law or the pickup provision or IRS code, because this is going to take real effort and action to fix.
When we took the 12.83 to council last year, the caveat I made to them is the 0.83% increase they're making is going to be that year's, and there's going to be more to come. That's why they budgeted the 2% this year. But they were very clear that if the trustees weren't willing to sit down and fairly negotiate and try to resolve this with the city, they're holding that money back. We have not started contributing. We budgeted it effective October 1, but council has not approved giving us the plan because we have not been able to work with the plan to come up with a collective agreement to fix it.
The other key thing that really was the main impact on the plan from Ike was the layoff of 26 police officers in fiscal year 11 that has driven the ratio of active members to retirees very low ever since then. This budget brings our staffing back up to pre-Ike levels. And that budget increased funding the police department itself by $1.5 million, $2 million, something like that, for 16 new positions. And then we also set aside the 2% amount, which is over $200,000. So we're all aware, and we were applying money to address the problem. However, it might be finally negotiated. You're absolutely right. That's the heart of the issue.
In the last legislative session and leading up to that, the City of Dallas Fire and Police had issues that seem to me may have some connection to some of the issues you have, and you may want to reach out to them both on the city side and on the side of the people that are running the board. They did make major change there. It took a long time. It came in eventually to the state legislature, but you might want to.
We have reached out to the city of Dallas. Actually, we just hired one of their assistant chiefs as our chief who lived through it. So he knows, and his recommendation is fix it, don't go to the legislature, because nobody's going to like the legislative result. And so he actually lived through it, so he's a good one to have on the team now to help work through it.
And one of my partners is a legislative affairs partner representing the City of Dallas the police and fire plan on the legislation, so he could also get involved and give his input.
Good.
May I interject? I got a couple of comments just in general about the situation. I guess other than a couple of comments about the past real quick, I really kind of wanted to talk about going forward. I think it's clear that the two main factors that were driving this situation are obviously the investment returns over the last 10 years and the effects of the Hurricane Ike, in which the number of active police officers was dramatically reduced. Thereby, there's less contributions coming in. So those are the two main things. We kind of analyze that. There's some other factors, but they're really small compared to that. Looking forward, I guess one of the things that is problematic here is that the members are contributing, and it's in the report here, that the members are contributing more than the normal cost in the plan. So they're contributing more than the benefits, the value of the benefits that they're receiving right now. And one of the things that is being considered, and in addition to contribution increases, is some benefit reductions. But I just want to make sure it's clear that if you try to solve this with benefit reductions without reducing the members' contributions, then the members are contributing even more than the cost of the benefits that they're earning going forward.
Yeah, I agree that could be an issue. The question I would have is, have you recalculated the normal cost using the new rate of return? Because, of course, that's built in.
Right.
I don't have the normal cost here in front of me. It's around 10%.
Right.
Members are paying 12%. I would guess that they're paying around the normal cost at the new rate of return.
It's still higher, but I think it's closer to 11 at 7.5%. So it's closer. But the other thing on the normal cost that's worth sharing is that the members' benefits are based on base pay, but the contributions that go in are based on total pay, including overtime, which overtime we're assuming is about 10% of pay of their base pay. So even if you were at 12% of pay and the normal cost is 12% of pay, they're not exactly the same.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Truthfully, looking at the numbers and looking at kind of the situation in Galveston, I know the numbers feel big from a city budget perspective, and the plan is severely underfunded. But I'm looking at the ADC numbers and some of the contribution numbers. The fact that you're already taking steps to lower the investment rate of return, I think this is a fixable thing, so. I mean, we can talk about what the members are contributing. I think that's right. I think the point is that there's room to negotiate here and actually come to a solution that's not going to be overly punitive to either the city or members. I think that is apparent from just my view on this, and that's a positive given the severely underfunded status of the plan. One point, though, on both the investment returns and the staffing, I get that if you go back and look at that technically, that those two things undershot projections at the time. But those are choices made in the funding plan. You choose your assumed rate of return, and if you set your assumed rate of return too high and you don't hit it, that's your choice on how you are funding the plan. That's not something. It's riskier the higher you get, and you can't predict exactly what the number is going to be, but the higher you go, the riskier that is. And you guys are way out on the risk spectrum whenever you raise to 8% in the 20 teens. And so just recognize that those are choices. The staffing as well, that was a problem because you choose to pay as a percentage of payroll instead of a hard dollar figure, and you're probably happy to have your contribution go down at the same time you were cutting members. That cuts both ways. So if you don't hire new police officers, that means that those police officers aren't there to accrue benefits either. I understand it's a contribution hit, but that's just because of the way you choose to accrue benefits. I encourage you to talk about those things not as things that are unanticipated downsides that you didn't have a choice over. Those are things you choose, and going forward, you can choose to be less risky in those assumptions. And I think that's the important part, not to say that you should have made different choices in the past. I think you should have, but going forward, just recognize that those are choices, and you can make different choices going forward.
You know, one thing that I failed to mention, and I'll mention it now, is that when we have met with the trustees, one of the discussions is the rate of return. Now, that rate of return is not a negotiated number. It's set by the actuary. The actuary makes recommendations to the trustees make the change. City has no input into that, but we have talked with them and we've discussed lowering the rate of return. And I'll tell you, across all three of our plans, when we've said that you need to lower off of 8, everybody says, yeah, we don't want to do it all at once. And we've encouraged our plans, just take the hit, let's get a number that's reasonable and supportable. The police have done it, so, you know, that is a positive step. They've lowered it. Whether that's the right number, I don't know. You know, again, it's based on the actuary, and I know you talked to Mr. Kreider, and we've got the actuary for the police plan here now, but both they have their methodology, and they put it in their black box, and they come up with a result. And all I can tell you is that they're all wrong. Every one of them. Every report you get's wrong. There's no perfect model. All we can do is use our best guess, best education, look at the capital market, see what prospectively you might be able to earn. Historically, right now, I just throw it out myself. I don't think you can look back in a period. It's unprecedented, our interest rate market. Now, you talked about the returns in the capital markets earlier, Mr. McGee, but I will tell you that those rates of return on the types of securities that the pension funds buy have been exceedingly low for an extraordinary length of time, and as a result, the compounding of the problem has happened probably since 2008. The stock market's done one thing, but if we had all our pension dollars in the stock market, the volatility would be incredible, and nothing any of us would want to address. So, yeah, it's a little different what you can get on the capital market side versus what we get when we invest on the pension side. But I think that I do want to make sure that we discuss the fact that they did lower that, and that's a positive step. We have one plan at 7.25, we have one at 7.5, and one at 7.75. All of them are the actuaries have done analysis, and they can support their assertions for those, whether they're high or low. I'm not going to be the one to say. I'm closer to 7% if I had my druthers, but you know, I yield to them because of their expertise.
I would encourage you. So I think it's a very positive step that you guys are having that conversation and you're lowering them. And all due respect to actuaries, it's one voice and they have a method, and they aren't necessarily capital market experts. They're experts in making the actuarial calculations, and so I think this is one area in particular where additional voices are helpful. And you know, I don't think any of us would want to try to pick the right number. And I don't think that's a good exercise. A good exercise is to have a fulsome discussion of risk. So how much funding risk is there here? What do we think the range of potential outcomes are? We've got to talk more in those ways. The report that our staff put together really talks about the risk that you fall short, and I encourage you to think in those terms instead of, hey, have we picked the right number? On interest rates, I agree with you wholeheartedly. The thing about interest rates is they actually capture some go-forward projection. Interest rates are necessarily some projection of future returns, and the fact that interest rates are low right now indicates that we're in that the market is predicting low growth, low return environment for the foreseeable future, and that's kind of built into what we're seeing on inflation, what we're seeing on treasuries, what we're seeing in a number of aspects. We've seen the market outpace that, and that should give us pause. Yeah. The fact that stocks have outpaced that expectation should give us a lot of pause. Now, those things may come back together, and that would be awesome, but our expectation should not be that they will. So I just encourage, I agree with you completely. I think interest rates is the right thing to kind of look look at and build up from there. I encourage you to get additional voices on rate of return and really think through that risk piece. I think it's great that the actuary is a professional advisor to you, but I think the days of being completely deferential to your actuary on rate of return and some of these assumptions should be over. And it should be on the trustees to take a little more responsibility for the decisions that they're making given the situation that we're in.
Building on what Josh had to say, when with a fixed rate plan, or when the actuarially determined contribution rate is not being contributed, the investment return assumption is somewhat academic because it's not being used to drive the funding of the plan. It's a piece of information. And it would be nice for all pension plans, in my opinion, to get to a point where the amount they're contributing is based on the true actuarial methods and assumptions, and in this case, the investment return assumption. So we can talk all day about what the investment return assumption ought to be, but if the contributions, if the return assumption is not being used to drive the actual contribution rate, it's academic. Y'all note in your very fine response that the actuary provided an estimate based on likely changes in assumption for next year's valuation, which would basically nearly double the employer's contribution to nearly 30%. And the letter goes on to say that if implemented this year, it would require offsetting reductions in this year's budget with 8 months remaining. One bite at a time. We don't have to get to 30% in 1 year, but it's commendable that y'all have identified the bogey, and that's the bogey, and that's the number we ought to be looking at, 30%. 12%, 13% is pitifully low. Police officers in Galveston participate in Social Security?
Yes, they do.
They do. I would, and I'm sure y'all have thought of this, I would strongly encourage you to develop a plan to get to the 30%. That's the bogey. That's the nut. That's where we need to be. 12, 13%, and I understand there are larger governance issues, and there's not a thing that this board can do about any of this, but particularly governance issues. And you've identified a governance issue that boggles my mind. Honestly, I can't get between you and the board, but something's going to have to improve on that score. You got 3 pension funds in Galveston. Are the assets pooled between the 3?
They're not.
Separately managed?
They are.
Has anybody ever talked about pooling the assets in order to generate a higher investment return and reduce fees?
We've talked the full gamut. We're looking at everything, but it's because of the 3 independent boards, the likelihood of that happening is almost none. The city has no control.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
I have one question.
Yes, sir.
Can I ask? One of the things that we haven't really talked about that much is what's driving benefits. And I was a little disappointed that the study, but not surprised that the study was unable to find true peer plans in the state. There's not any other PDs the size of Galveston that have their own plan. And the peers were all fire departments. And of course, some of a pension, the nature of the pension, the age at which somebody's eligible, the period of time that they may be receiving benefits is driven by the nature of the work. Well, my question is a 9% annual increase over a 20-year period of time in benefits, is that typical? We've got some things driving our benefits at a rate of an average increase of 9% a year since '96, and contributions have gone up 6%. The imbalance between those two, and we've talked about contributions, that's what's causing the problem, and all we're saying here is the contributions have to come up to match that higher growth rate. And I'm asking if that's really true.
So on the benefits side, whenever you say benefits, you're saying that liabilities are increasing at 9%
I'm talking about annual benefit payout.
Annual benefit payouts.
In theory, if you're funded adequately, your contributions should rise proportionate over time to your benefit payout. And instead, and I'm trying to say, what is it about benefits that would drive them at 9% a year, and are we concerned about that?
I think your plan is maturing, and so you're having more people that are in retirement, in inactive status. And if done correctly for a prepaid plan, you would have those benefits fully funded up. So you would have the money on hand. Going cash flow negative that's a normal thing for a plan that has been around for a while. Whenever I say a mature plan, I mean a plan that's been around for a while, especially a public safety plan where people retire relatively early relative to the rest of the population. So we'll have long retirements generally, and so you just have more weight towards people that are already retired and drawing. So I don't, from my point of view, that's not a huge deal. The bigger deal is the liability number, and are your payments enough to make your assets keep pace with and catch up with your liability number? And right now they're not.
Well, of course, that's our funding dilemma. Back to the nut of the matter that you talked about a while ago. We have no control at the city over benefit levels. So to the extent that benefits just have to be funded, it's all our problem.
But for me, from my perspective, and I think from this committee's perspective, we recognize that that's a governance challenge, but it's not our oversight responsibility to try to fix that. Our responsibility is to make sure that benefits and assets match, and that these things are well funded, and that the benefit promises that are being made can be paid, and that we don't see cities getting themselves into financial trouble because they're making payments, they're making promises and not funding those up, and get into a crisis that harms taxpayers and workers alike. So that's our. I totally get that you need to sit down with the board, with labor, and talk about this, and you should have a full and frank discussion with them. What we care about is the liability number and the asset number, and those things are getting further apart, and they need to get closer together. So do what you need to get those things closer together.
You have any other questions or comments?
From the city's perspective, we do not. We truly appreciate the opportunity to come and have this discussion with you. We'd love to have future discussions with you. We're in contact with your office as we make progress, toward addressing it. We'll certainly communicate and work with you guys.
We appreciate you coming out.
Thank you.
We appreciate your testimony. And if there are members of the board who'd like to work directly with the PRB staff, I'm sure the PRB staff would be happy to work with them as well.
Thank you.
And I would echo that wholeheartedly. Thank you for coming in.
In fact,
thank you for doing this.
Attend council today is greatly appreciated. And come to Austin, Texas. It's one of my favorite things to do.
Here you said you drew the short straw.
I know it's a long straw. I got an Aggie as a boss, so he doesn't like to come to Austin. Period. But thank you.
So a question about what you're going to do next. When the Greenville fire was up here, you were talking about reflecting the higher contribution rates. So at this point, you're not going to do any additional analysis on the 7.5%, or is that?
What I'd like to see. What I'd like to see is if y'all could supply the staff with the new projections based on the return assumption, whatever other changes to methods and assumptions you've developed, and provide that to staff so we can have the most up-to-date information in this report. Is that possible?
I think it is. I mean, we have generally the numbers. I do need to just double check with the board that that's okay with them. I guess the thing that is in my mind still not clear is what the city is actually contributing this year, what to put there as far as the forecast.
We have a budgeted number that you could use.
That would be great, and we'd be happy in the report, I'm sure, to caveat all of this, to say that some of this is still in flux, and this is the best information we have available from the city of the plan.
Because if you're going with an assumption that's going to apply to a subsequent period, in that subsequent period, when the actuals come in, we will have contributed a larger amount.
And I think that we would be willing to give the plan and the city credit for taking that positive step, and also the budgetary step.
And if you can get your 2017 return numbers in there, they'd probably improve the situation too.
I could ask about that as well.
Flattening it'll be good, but it's not. You certainly won't reflect the full breadth of all the earnings that came in 2017, which were substantial.
Be better if you had all the money in there.
One last thing, I think this was clear, even though there hasn't been a long-term solution, that hasn't been resolved yet. Hopefully it's clear that there have been a lot of work and a lot of discussion between the city and the boards, trying to resolve this issue. And, as you've heard from the discussions, there's a lot of complex things going on outside of just actuarial issues. So, thank you.
I want to speak to that if I could. We sit here in Austin, and speaking just for myself, I wonder what level of attention these pension issues get among cities like Galveston and Greenville and others. It's very helpful to know that it has your attention and that y'all are working on it.
Just a follow-up comment to that then is, one of the things that I've seen the last couple of years is the funding soundness requirements has been a big help in forcing the boards and the cities to work together to have these tough discussions that in some prior years they just may have just ignored. So
we're hopeful that this exercise as well will help with that. Will help us have a positive discussion about solutions. So,
and if we can collectively agree to anything, I would think, or just Galveston, Greenville, and everybody else, is that the quicker you can get the boards to lower those earnings assumptions, the better picture you guys will have and we'll all have of the true condition of these plans.
And members, just to quickly mention for the next steps, when we get the updated information from the plan, we will update the report to present to the full board on March 1st, and then the end goal would be to include this review in our November report that we present to the legislature, and hopefully we will have a plan from the fund and the city that we could include to update the legislature at that point then.
We'll use that as our target date.
Thank you.
Is the staff update next, or is
No, we have a motion.
thank you all. I think you're good to go.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So you would want to make a motion again. Yes, second one. Members, like Greenville, we have a motion for Galveston Police as well.
the chair entertains a motion or direct a motion to direct staff to finalize the draft and
incorporating changes in the Galveston Fire Employees Retirement Plan for police, including or incorporating any technical updates
to present to the full board.
To present to the full board.
So moved.
I'll move that. I'd like to request that the staff language include a reference to the law regarding the contribution, to clarify that the contributions need to be made pursuant to state and city law.
Okay, we'll do that.
Thank you. And with that amendment, I'll second it.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The motion passes.
And so that motion passes.
Moving on to the next item.
Staff.
Discuss and consider.
Okay, we're now going to be talking about a discussion and consider system actuarial review metrics and processes. We'll be hearing staff update and then seeing if there's any public comment after that.
Okay, members, I just realized I haven't been directing you to which section of the packet throughout this, but we're behind tab 4 now, which contains an updated copy of the plan review data and the various metrics that we consider to help prioritize the plans that we look at first. Obviously, we've said this in the past, I'll say it again, this is not the only driving factor, but this gives us an easy snapshot to kind of identify where plans stand and consider which ones we think need to be taken a look at. We also take into other factors that we might know about that are going on as well. But so this includes updated data as compared to the last actuarial committee meeting. For all of the additional plan evaluations that we have received, it includes a couple of minor edits as well to the way this looks. We added market value of assets. I'm not sure if it's confusing where we placed it. It is not one of the metrics that we are using for making this determination. It was one of the board members asked that we add it to get a general sense of plan size, but it's not necessarily one of the metrics that's being incorporated when we take a look at it. And then there's a couple of minor color coding items that were changed, but all of those can be seen in the key at the very end as to what they stand for.
Members, we will start the next review cycle where, based on this information, we will determine the next set of plans that we would start reviewing. And at the last committee meeting, members, you all had suggested or wanted or had expressed interest in having more discussion about coming up with a framework to quantify these metrics, and we included the updated information to facilitate that discussion.
The updated information being the color coding, the updated color coding?
Updated color coding, adding the market value of assets, as well as for some systems we did receive their updated valuation. So for not all systems though, but for some we did include their updated actuarial valuation information as well.
Great. I see we're still using the fall colors.
Yes.
Anything else, staff?
When you go to select plans that will be the second, I found this the review process, the reports, the responses incredibly helpful, and hopefully the plans and the boards found them helpful as well. I think that it'll be very informative to the rest of the pension review board. I think it's going to be a great benefit to the board, the full board, as well as to the legislature. So the reports were great. I enjoyed this process. I think we're moving in the right direction on a lot of this. And so how will you select the next plans, and how many do you expect to select?
In the last review cycle, because of time constraints, we had to drop one of the systems, Marshall Fire, that we were going to review. So in this cycle, we will include Marshall Fire. In addition, generally our process is that our actuarial or finance team as a whole, we sit down and start with the amortization period and funded ratios to look at the systems that are in the reds, and then go across the metrics to look at other factors that we have included. So we try to look at a plan in a more holistic way rather than just looking at one metric. We do prioritize based on maybe the amortization period, of course, but also to look at the funded ratio. And then we also glean out some of the historical data to make that determination. We don't necessarily assign weights to any of these metrics, as you know, and that's a point that was raised at the last committee meeting, that could be an option to consider.
This is going to be a process, and right now, in my view, some of this, and pardon the expression, but some of these plans are low-hanging fruit. It's obvious that we need to hear from them, to me, and we don't need a statistical analysis to determine which plans we ought to be hearing from. Honestly, I do think, though, that being said, that we could begin to move in the direction of developing some quantitative summary of this data that we can start out as a fairly simple exercise, and I might suggest that we come up with a simple variance from the mean for each of these factors, and accumulate the variance from the mean for each plan, to the good or to the bad, that could spit out some indication of just how far off from sort of the norm a plan is. And that would begin to give us some quantitative idea of the plans that are in more trouble than others. And from there, I would think that we could continue to refine this. So, for example, with regard to amortization period, setting aside the infinities for the moment, we could come up with a mean or median value for amortization periods, and then measure the difference between the mean or median to the plan's actual figure, and come up with some quantification of that, the distance from the norm, and do that for each of these various factors.
Yeah, I'd be open to that. The only thing to consider, so we can talk about the particulars of how to actually execute on that offline, is that if you've got to have some standard unit if you're going to do that across, if you're going to do some comparison across, but we can talk about how best to do that and then how to handle infinities. One thing that we might want to consider on some of this where there is readily available nationwide or close to nationwide information is to also just benchmark where Texas stands, where these plans stand against the nation, just because you're below average in Texas may not mean you're below average in the nation. Although I think Texas on rate of return and some measures like that, Texas has a higher median rate of return assumption than the national average, and so I just want to make sure that we're not just benchmarking internally where we can, but also at benchmarking externally.
Sounds good.
Weekend members definitely take a stab at coming up with a proposal, and we'll work with you as we are drafting the proposal for the next actuarial committee meeting.
I'm still comments.
One question about the market value of assets. Keith, I believe it was you that requested that be on there. So it was to get an idea just of the total size of the plan.
Yep.
Okay. And we're not considering that as a metric. I heard that correct,
and we
right?
can move that towards the end of the last column, so it's not confusing.
And funded ratio is actuarial, is based on smoothed assets. I'm going to stop saying actuarial assets because that's meaningless.
For the most part, but for systems that use market value, it would be based
We
on.
do have some that do.
Handful maybe that use.
So it's assets as reported in the actuarial valuations or the CAFRs, which could be smoothed or market.
Yeah. Good.
Got it.
Comments from the audience.
Sure.
We have time at this time receive public comments. If anyone has any comment, we'd like to hear from them.
Just one. I think we would invite him at the end of this. Okay. Items discussions.
We to Fort Worth now. Is that next?
We do have a motion. So members, if
Go ahead. Tell
you
me.
don't have any further comments, we do have a motion for this agenda item. Yeah.
This one?
Yep.
The chair entertains a motion to direct staff to develop a proposal or purposes of a framework to qualify the system actuarial review metro incorporating committee discussion and
to present to the committee.
To present to the committee at its next meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Motion passes.
Motion passes. You want to talk about Fort
Sure.
Worth now?
Members, the next item on the agenda is for staff to provide an update on the funding soundness restoration plan for the Fort Worth Employees Retirement Fund. As you know, the city manager has appointed a pension task force to work on the recommendations to develop a plan to fix the funding challenges being experienced by the Fort Worth Employees Plan. On November 21st, the city manager provided a set of recommendations to the task force to consider. Included in that recommendation the two factors they were shooting for, and they mentioned that subsequent to the committee meeting that they had attended here in Austin, the two equations that are the two main items that they gathered from that discussion was to look at a closed 30-year funding approach for the plan, as well as to consider whether or not their return assumption was appropriate. In light of that discussion, and as part of developing this funding plan, they are looking at calculating a contribution rate based on a closed 30-year amortization period for the plan for the legacy liability, as well as to further lower their return assumption to 7.5%. They are also considering options moving forward to use a layered approach for future gains and losses. Now, the two main changes that they are considering is to increase the city as well as member group contribution rates. The city has proposed to increase, or the city manager's recommendation proposes to increase the city's contribution rate by 2%, and to increase the member group contribution rates by 1% for all three groups. Now, as you know, they have a bifurcated benefit structure, so they call the benefit that the members have prior to 2011 or 2013, excuse me, but they call that as the blue service benefit, which is a higher benefit than what the member groups have now. So for civilian, they would be raising, in addition to the 1%, for the blue service, the civilian group would be contributing an additional 0.5%. The police and fire groups would be contributing an additional 2%. The recommendation also proposes to suspend COLA for the future years, and there is a recommendation in there that the COLA could potentially be triggered down the line if the funded ratio improves or if the plan meets certain financial marks. These discussions are still ongoing, and the city manager has requested the member groups to come back with any other proposals that the members may have. There is some discussion about the COLA change. There is some disagreement between the member groups and the city manager's recommendation. So it's my understanding that the member groups have been asked to come back with their proposal, and the hope is for the negotiations to reach a point where the pension task force can present the recommended funding plan to the city council sometime in March or April.
Do you have a copy of the city's proposal?
I do. I did receive a copy, and I'd be happy to share that with the members. Yes.
Thank you for that update. Is it your understanding that the additional proposed required contributions would get them up to the required actuarially determined contribution?
So they have included some analysis, and the funds actually has briefly looked at the recommended changes. But the analysis they have included is based on suspending the COLA. So if there is additional discussion that needs to happen with regards to COLA, that contribution rate would have to be tweaked or changed. But this point, based on the recommendation and based on the analysis of the actuary, just looking at the recommendation with the COLA being suspended, it does appear that with those contribution rate changes or increases, they would be able to meet the funding gap.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anu. We'd love to see the analysis from the city, and to the extent that we receive additional counter proposals or analysis from labor groups or the city or the plans, would love to see that along the way too. If they're heading towards a March, April presentation before council, would love to see that before they get there if possible, but just want to keep tabs on
What do you want to also say before March 1, our next meeting, or
March 1st
March
is
1st?
our next board meeting.
Yeah, it would be fantastic if we could see it before then. I just
Sure.
don't know. I mean, they've been working on this for quite a while, so while they may be shooting for March or April, it'll be. It's yet to be seen whether they'll actually
Right.
hit that.
And there are some intermediary steps that would have to be taken. For example, the members do have to vote on the contribution increase. So once they reach an agreement, they'd have to take additional steps to formulate the plan and implement it in practice. But it's encouraging to see the recommendation itself that they are looking at a risk and cost sharing structure, so the burden is spread out among the city or the taxpayers and the member groups.
Yeah, I'm pleased to see that they incorporated some of our recommendations. It's nice to see shared sacrifice and improve funding policy.
Should we look at this and put something in front of all of our members at our March 1 meeting, or should we wait until they're finished, which could mean another
At this
6
point,
months or a year?
Right. Given they are looking at an April deadline, and if we end up having another committee meeting in April, I could certainly come back and provide an update on where they stand with their funding plan. But if not March, then certainly at our next board meeting, which we expect to have in June sometime, hopefully we'll see an adopted plan.
What is our April date? Do we have one?
We don't have a date yet.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just say I'm happy to leave that up to the discretion of staff as to whether that information is worth including. I think that certainly we'll, in our full board meeting, have an update on the actuarial committee meeting, and we can touch on this as a point where we talk to Fort Worth, and Fort Worth is incorporating some of our recommendations into their plan as we feel like they're diligently working in good faith to arrive at a proposal. So it can be a positive that this process seems to be facilitating good conversation and not just additional scrutiny of the plans, but actually moving towards good solutions.
It's my understanding in their recommendation they looked at the current Houston contribution structure or the funding policy that the plans down in Houston have implemented, as well as some of the other states that are currently that have a plan for a cost and risk sharing structure for funding their pension plans.
Anything else on you would like to say on Fort Worth?
That's all I have, members. Thank you. I want to invite date and location of next meeting sometime in April.
Yeah, I think that just to let everybody know that we are looking at a next meeting of the actuarial committee to be held sometime in April.
And then open the floor for our audience participation.
Any participation from the audience requested?
Robert, Matthew, Nathan.
Robert Nathan.
From CPS Energy.
CPS Energy in San Antonio? Guess not. to adjourn. There's no other business to come before the committee. This meeting will be closed.